Several months ago, I released a video discussing what I felt to be the best value ThinkPads that you could buy in 2020. This video received quite a bit of attention, and it quickly became the most viewed video on my channel. In that video, I focused on 3 ThinkPads that I felt offered solid performance and upgradability for a reasonable price: the T420, the T430, and the T440p. However, all of these models have a couple of drawbacks that hurt their overall appeal. They're relatively thick and heavy, especially by modern standards. Battery life isn't the best with their power-hungry processors, and they're near the end, if not at the end, of their official support from Lenovo. Additionally, many people wanted to hear my thoughts on some of the newer, slimmer models that have been released since. With the holidays around the corner and many people in the market for a laptop, whether for themselves or as a gift to somebody else, I feel now is a good time to talk about some of the newer, thinner ThinkPads out there that I still think are a good value. A lot of this is subject to your own interpretation. Everybody has a different idea of what is a good value. The factors I consider for a good value ThinkPad are the price, the availability of parts and upgrades, and performance. Like last time, this video will be focusing on the ThinkPad T series since they are generally the least expensive and most common options when looking for a cheap used ThinkPad. Between current events in the world and the holiday season around the corner, laptop prices are always fluctuating, especially for used machines. Despite this, I've tried my best to look for an accurate average price for these machines. As of when I'm making this video, the cheapest laptops featured can be found for as little as $150 or even $100 if you really look, and the most expensive ones can usually be found for around $400. If you keep your eyes peeled, or if you don't mind making some repairs yourself, you can probably find one for cheaper than what the usual going rate is. As for specific models of ThinkPad that I will be focusing on today, I will be focusing on the T440 through the T460, as well as their slimmer S-suffixed counterparts. While I will always prefer the classic ThinkPad models like the T420 and the T430 over these newer machines, they're still very solid laptops, and they've become more affordable in the last couple of years. Obviously, a newer quad-core processor will perform better, and even some of the higher-end chips in the T440p will outperform what these have to offer. But the U-series processors in these models are still generally good enough for everyday tasks. While these laptops aren't quite as upgradable as the T440p, many of them offer a reasonable amount of upgrades and can be easily serviced. The same design was kept for multiple generations, so a lot of the same replacement parts are compatible with all of these models, or most of them. Not only does it make it easier to find replacement parts, but this also makes it cheaper most of the time. There's a lot more to discuss as we go along here, so let's get started. The ThinkPad T series has always been one of Lenovo's flagship laptops, generally being considered the all-around notebook that's in between the premium thin and light Ultraportables in the X series and the high-performance but thick and heavy W and P series. The T series started to see major design changes in 2012 and 2013. The first major change was the move from the classic ThinkPad keyboard to the island-style chiclet keyboard seen with the T430. And then, a year later, more drastic changes came with the introduction of the T440. It was clear that the T440 marked the T-series transition to a modern Ultrabook form factor. There were many controversial design changes made with this model, such as the removal of much of the I/O and expansion options, making the RAM partially soldered, and perhaps most infamously, the buttonless touchpad, often referred to by many as the clunkpad. Many of these design changes are to this day still frowned upon, but the negative opinions most people have of the T440 have also resulted in used models being extremely cheap. If you look around, you can find one of these for as little as $100. Additionally, the worst of the T440's changes, the buttonless touchpad, can be remedied by swapping in a T450 touchpad, and a simple patch driver allows everything to work correctly. The move from mobile to U-series processors allowed for much better battery life in the T440 than its predecessors, and the T440 also introduced the PowerBridge battery system, which allows you to hot swap batteries on the go without powering down the laptop. The biggest downsides of this model, other than the clunkpad, would have to be the limited RAM expansion and lackluster port selection. The T440 only has one SODIMM slot, with additional RAM being soldered on some configurations. Depending on your configuration, this limits you to only 8 or 12 gigabytes of RAM. To be fair, for most people this will be enough, but when older models supported 16 gigabytes of RAM, it's a big downgrade. There's only 2 USB ports, limiting how many peripherals can be attached without an external dongle, USB hub, or dock. The keyboard can also be a royal pain to remove, with the screws being hidden underneath the keys and some variants having these rubber stoppers that need to be removed from behind the battery. Additionally, replacing the touchpad is a pretty cumbersome task since you need to remove the entire motherboard just to get access to all of its screws. Indicator LEDs for things like drive activity, charging, and even caps lock are notably absent. And the display options from the factory are the same god-awful 1366 by 768 and 1600 by 900 TN panels that older ThinkPads had offered. However, unlike older models, a 1080p IPS display can be swapped in without the use of an adapter or upgrade kit. Alongside the standard T400 series is the T400S lineup. I like to consider this laptop a halfway point between the thinner and more premium X1 Carbon and the thicker and heavier T-series. Buying one of these S-suffix models gives you a thinner machine with more premium build materials than the regular T-series, at the expense of some upgrades. It does retain more ports and upgradability than the X1 Carbon series, and it also keeps a mechanical docking connector that is absent from the X1 Carbon. The T440S was released with many of the same controversial design changes that were made with the T440. However, I generally consider this to be the stronger of the two models, because it actually has more going for it than the T440. Unlike later models, it really isn't that much of a compromise between the T-series and the X1 Carbon lineup. It has all of the same I/O as the T440, and additionally has a third USB port. It was configurable with IPS displays from the factory. Every configuration came with the 4GB of RAM soldered on. And the construction is thinner and uses more premium materials than the T440. It also has the same power bridge system that the T440 has, allowing you to hot swap batteries. Similar to its thicker counterpart, if you don't like the buttonless touchpad, you can easily swap in one from the T450. The only real advantage of the T440 over the T440S is that it's generally more affordable. Moving on to the T450, this mostly kept the same design as the T440. However, it addressed many of the biggest design flaws with its predecessor. Dedicated trackpoint buttons return with this model and have stayed ever since. Fully upgradable RAM was also brought back with 2 SODIMM slots. And thanks to the improved capabilities of the Broadwell processors used, the T450 can use up to 32GB of RAM. Display options are still fairly limited with this model, and issues are somewhat compounded by Lenovo's choice to implement a display whitelist. This means if you use an aftermarket panel, the brightness controls won't work correctly in Windows. However, if you use Linux, this probably won't be an issue. Thankfully, with later models, Lenovo realized that this was a stupid decision, but they haven't bothered to remove the display whitelist from the T450, even though it could probably be done with an easy BIOS update. That being said, the T450 should accept a 1080p IPS display from the T450S and work correctly in Windows. The T450S is physically identical to the T440S, with the sole change being the restoration of dedicated trackpoint buttons. It also uses a glass touchpad, which generally feels nicer to use than the Mylar touchpad found on most other models. The T450S continues to use half-soldered RAM with 1 SODIMM slot, but thanks to the architecture improvements already mentioned, you can now use up to 20GB of total RAM. Like its thicker counterpart, the T450S has a display whitelist, which limits display upgradability if you plan on using Windows. If you have a lot of programming knowledge, it is possible to remove the whitelist yourself, or at least trick the machine into thinking you're using a genuine panel. With its successors moved to sealed-in batteries, the T450S is also the thinnest ThinkPad you can buy with a removable battery. The T460 shares, for the most part, the same design as the T440 and the T450, using the same keyboards, touchpads, batteries, etc. However, there are 2 differences that set the T460 apart from its older counterparts. It replaces the VGA port with an HDMI port, and for the first time, Full HD IPS displays can be configured from the factory on this model. Rather interestingly, despite the move to Skylake processors, which generally use DDR4 RAM, and even other ThinkPads from the same generation moving to DDR4, the T460 retained the use of DDR3L RAM. Like its predecessor, it can take up to 32GB of RAM. While it missed out on some of the substantial feature improvements that its slimmer counterpart received, the T460 is still an incredibly solid machine, with some good upgrades available and reasonable performance. This laptop also starts to get onto the more expensive side of things, usually selling for between $250 and $350. All of these models, with the exception of the T460S, can use either a 2.5-inch SATA drive or a 42mm M.2 SATA SSD, or both if you want. The T460S brought some changes to the ThinkPad design formula, some seen as improvements and some not. The T460S moved to a more tapered design akin to that of a MacBook Air. Some notable advances include the return of the matte black ThinkPad finish, as opposed to that weird dark gray color that was being used before. Indicator LEDs for charging and caps lock also returned. Lenovo made the move to DDR4 RAM with this model, and bumped up the configurable soldered RAM to 8GB, giving you up to 24GB of RAM when maxed out. Like the T460, the T460S replaces the VGA port with an HDMI port, eliminating the need for a dongle when hooking up to more modern displays. Lenovo also introduced the new touch-based fingerprint reader on this model, which I think is a major improvement over the old swiping-based sensor they used on older ThinkPads. The biggest improvements, in my opinion, are the move to NVMe SSDs and the introduction of 1440p display options. There's some welcome changes from a service standpoint as well. After removing a few screws, the bottom easily comes off without any of the fragile and stubborn tabs that are still used on other T-Series models. Additionally, Lenovo adjusted the screw locations for the touchpad, allowing it to be replaced without having to take out the entire motherboard. However, with these improvements come a few downgrades. Support for 2.5-inch SATA drives, mechanical or solid state, ended with the removal of the SATA slot. While the keyboard did see some minor design changes over the T450S's keyboard, it continues to use the annoying convoluted method of securing the keyboard in place, with hidden screws. The worst change made, in my opinion, is the removal of the external, hot-swappable battery, in favor of a sealed-in design. I understand to an extent that this was done to make the laptop thinner. However, there's still 2 batteries when you open the machine up. Not only does this change prevent you from hot-swapping batteries on the go, but it also prevents you from using higher capacity batteries, which heavily limits the maximum battery life of the machine compared to its thicker and older counterparts. Despite these downsides, the T460S retains a very good selection of ports, and manages to keep things like Ethernet and a full-sized SD card reader available despite the slimmer design. The T460S is probably one of the most expensive models featured in this video, with prices easily surpassing $300 to $400. Now to briefly mention the 2 honorable mentions, the T470 and the T470S. I've actually used the T470S as a stand-in for the T460S because other than the move to Thunderbolt, it's physically identical. My T470S also continues to use a Skylake processor, so performance results are comparable to that of a T460S. Normally, I think these are decent laptops, and they are cheaper than their newer counterparts, but the average selling price of these is still a bit higher than the other laptops I've featured in this video, and for the performance they offer, I wouldn't consider them to be a good value unless you find one for a very cheap price. That was the case with this T470S. It was broken when I bought it, so it was much cheaper than what these are normally worth. The only major upgrade over its predecessors is the addition of Thunderbolt, replacing the mini DisplayPort on older models. Other than that, the 7th generation U-Series dual-core chips don't offer major performance boosts over their 6th generation counterparts, and graphics performance is just a little bit better at best. Of course, prices and availability are always changing, and sometimes you'll get lucky and find a very, very cheap one listed somewhere. So if you happen to find one for a very good price, then these laptops get my recommendation. Moving further down the ThinkPad family tree, it may also make sense for me to bring up the T480 and the T480S. They were the last models to maintain the design language initially established by the T440, before the entire ThinkPad line received a design overhaul with the T490 series. However, because they're much newer and they use quad-core processors, these laptops are more desirable right now and thus more expensive. I already did an entire video about the T480 if you want to see my thoughts on that, so discussing it again here would be fairly redundant. None of these laptops are going to be a replacement for your desktop or a mobile workstation, but performance is generally good enough for everyday tasks and light productivity. The dual-core U-Series processors in these machines weren't anything special even when they were new. The T480's move to quad-core processors and the increased presence of AMD-powered ThinkPads in recent years make these systems look pretty dated. However, because of Intel's lack of improvements over multiple generations, while there will be some improvements from the oldest to the newest featured here, it won't be a night and day difference with any of them. Larger improvements were made from one generation to another in terms of graphics, but none of these laptops were designed with gaming or 3D rendering in mind. The use of low-power processors hurts the amount of raw horsepower these machines have, but sticking to less power-hungry chips allows for much better battery life than what older ThinkPads were capable of. These models make use of the PowerBridge battery system, except the T460S, where there's a built-in 24 watt-hour battery, and the choice of either a 24, 48, or 72 watt-hour external battery. This gives you up to 96 watt-hours in total. Some very low-end configurations of these laptops omitted the internal battery, but you can easily add one yourself. With the maxed out 96 watt-hour configuration, people have managed to get as much as 17 hours of continuous use out of a single charge. And if you carry around a few spare batteries, it's possible to get much more time away from an outlet. While the T460S unfortunately removed this feature, I was still able to get more than 4 hours of heavy use out of my T470S with the screen at maximum brightness. And when I dimmed the screen and messed with the power settings, I was able to get close to 7 hours on a single charge. With every model featuring multiple USB ports, Ethernet, full-sized SD card reader, a headphone jack, and 2 types of display outputs, you have a lot of connectivity options available to you built into the laptop. Support for a mechanical dock opens up some more possibilities for expansion. Unlike on the newest ThinkPads, the power jack is easily replaceable, so if somebody trips over your laptop or the connector wears out, you aren't completely screwed over. While people can endlessly debate about how these stack up compared to older ThinkPads, all of the models that I've used and have worked on feel very well built. As I've said earlier, the slimmer S-suffix models use some nicer materials in their construction, but even a standard T-series will be able to stand up to the demands of everyday use. While I still overwhelmingly prefer the classic keyboard layout over the modern island-style 6-row layout, modern ThinkPad keyboards are still substantially better than what's offered on most other laptops. The layout is pretty straightforward as well, with no oversized arrow keys or oddly placed function keys like you'll find on many other laptop keyboards. Other than the god-awful buttonless clunk pad of the T440 series, the touchpads are fairly decent and are an improvement over the ones found on older ThinkPads. The track point works as well as you can expect, once you have a model that has dedicated buttons. Alright, so this gives you a basic idea of what the webcam looks like, and what the microphone sounds like on any of these laptops. Unfortunately, improving the video and sound quality of these on laptops has not been a really big priority for most manufacturers, so it doesn't really matter what laptop you get, it's going to look something like this. It's nothing amazing, but I think for basic teleconferencing, it gets the job done. Other than that, I'm not really sure what else there is to say. While I will always prefer my older ThinkPads over the newer ones, they're getting to the point that they offer an incredible value, especially compared to buying a new laptop. And I think for most people, they're thin and light enough that they're not going to hurt your back. Being business-class laptops, they're built to last and are for the most part built to be serviced. And the battery flexibility offered by the PowerBridge system is something you don't see on any other laptop. Tons of support is available from both Lenovo and the ThinkPad community, helping extend the lifespan of these computers beyond their intended expiration date. With many businesses and organizations retiring their older laptops in favor of something new, it's easy to get your hands on one of these older ThinkPads for a very good price while also saving them from the landfill. If there's any other ThinkPads you want me to look at, then definitely feel free to let me know. As always, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching.